I go and listen to the old Joe Budden podcast episodes, and he's talking about how it's just a situation of overvaluing. He's saying he's bringing in 9 figures. He's saying this, and that. But then months later, when you pull the curtains back and you're no longer on Spotify, like, you're bringing in 9 figures. You're bringing in millions of listeners. Okay, maybe that's true, but maybe some of that is true because of what Spotify is putting into it. I don't know the last time the Joe Budden TV on YouTube, I don't know the last time that channel had a 1 million view video. So it certainly wasn't that the podcast was bringing in millions of views and 9 figures. 9 figures is hundreds of millions of dollars. So that wasn't the case. The podcast doesn't even get 1 million views on its own on YouTube. That wasn't the case. And I doubt that 9 figures are coming in to Patreon from the subscriptions. You know, I doubt 8 figures. I doubt 6 figures are coming in to Patreon. So it wasn't that the Joe Budden podcast on Spotify was bringing this company so much value, and we're running this thing, and y'all need to be giving us more respect. And okay, so let's talk about the content itself, because these are the content kings of content. It's just very interesting business decision making, right? So you leave Spotify. So Joe knew he was leaving Spotify for a while before he left. I mean, on the podcast, he's basically prepping the viewers for this months in advance. But in hindsight, it's like the only thing he did was tell us, like, yo, we're leaving, don't get too comfortable. Like, he would tell the fans, like, we're leaving this dump, we're leaving, burning a bridge that doesn't need to be burnt. But that's neither here nor there. But instead of just bragging or telling us you're going to leave, it might have been a good idea to acclimate your audience with the new personalities that you plan to feature on your network, like Ming Lee, like the See the Thing Is podcast girls whose names escape me at the moment. You might have wanted to feature them as a guest on the podcast while you were still on Spotify. You might have wanted to, all those times you call people from the phone on the podcast, you might have wanted to call one of them, script some stuff, stage something to where you can introduce them to your audience in the natural way. Now, again, I stopped watching like the full episode of the Joe Budden podcast, I want to say like 2019. I was really in for it, for like when Pusha T Drake was going on. I like hearing music talk. So as they slowly stepped away from music, like I don't want to hear gossip. Like, I don't listen to talk show. I don't listen to stuff like that. It's just not interesting to me. It would have been a good idea to acclimate your audience with those people, especially while you're still on Spotify. So again, I don't think they appreciated the value that Spotify was bringing. Sure, okay, let's say they did some messed up stuff. Let's say they did you dirty. There's some value still that they're bringing. I don't think they fully appreciated the value that Spotify was bringing. Hey, let's use this last month, these last 2 weeks. Let's bring this girl on. She's gonna have her own podcast on our network. None of our audience, we have not introduced her to our audience at all. It's probably a good idea to have her on at least, or on one show. Or maybe it did happen and I missed it. If it happened, I must have missed that episode. So I mean, excuse me, if it did happen, maybe it should have happened more. Because when the See the Thing Is podcast and the Girl I Guess podcast came out, it's kind of like, who are these people? It's kind of like the Joe Budden team, which is banking on these people are popular on social media. They're going to go crazy. Like, they're popular people on social media. Of course, their podcast is going to go crazy. Because even Karen Civil, who's well known in the hip hop community, some of her videos is only, like, she's barely scraping 10,000. Like, she's getting above 10. At this point, she's getting just above 10,000, like, on the last, in the 25th hour. You know what I'm saying? But again, it's like banking on Karen Civil's name. Like, oh, they know Karen Civil. Her podcast was gonna go crazy. Like, you still have to. There's a certain amount of respect that you gotta have for the audience. Like, you have to prep your audience for this. Just to throw out a new show. And let me look at the YouTube. There are 6 shows. Pull Up, See the Thing Is, the Joe Budden podcast, Girl I Guess, the Joe Budden podcast cartoon, and State of the Culture. Alright? So let's start with State of the Culture. We haven't seen one of those episodes. It's been, 2 years? Scotty Beam left that show. That show pretty much stopped after Scotty Beam left. So a co-host left State of the Culture. See the Thing Is, I believe her name is Olivia. A co-host left that show. The Joe Budden podcast, you got Rory and Mal, 2 co-hosts, left that show. So you look, it's six. It's a network, right? It's 6 shows. And here's another thing. I don't think they understand their audience. I don't think Joe Budden understands his audience. You got 6 shows, right? Out of those 6, Pull Up does not happen anymore. State of the Culture doesn't happen anymore. So you really got 4 shows. Out of those 4 shows, the Joe Budden podcast cartoon, that's not really a show. That's just, an animator taking clips from the podcast and putting cartoons over it. So let's say there are 6 shows, but 3 are actually shows. So the 3 we have left are the Joe Budden podcast, which is, experiencing some turmoil right now, Girl I Guess, and See the Thing Is. Those 2 other podcasts, Girl I Guess and See the Thing Is, being women-based podcasts. And this is another thing. I don't understand why Joe Budden thought it would be a good idea to have. Here's the thing. It's not just that it's women-based. Just because they're women doesn't mean they can't pull in views. But it's just strange on your network, on the Joe Budden network, and Joe Budden looking at his own podcast. Like, he talks about stats and data and analytics. At the very least, I assume you have your gender demographics data. Like, you can access that on YouTube. You can just click on analytics and access that. It's like one of the most simple data that they give you on every website. I'm sure you can see that most of your audience is male. So, like, the first thought to have an all-women podcast is just interesting. Because even the women who watch your show don't watch your show to want to hear these women talk about these topics in this way. Like, they're watching your show to get a certain viewpoint because they have a certain viewpoint, or they like hearing your viewpoint. So to go and get a woman podcast, all women podcast, it's an interesting move. It's not just the fact that it's all women. It's just the fact that it doesn't, like, nothing in your data says to do that. Like, how did you make that business decision? Like, none of the data says to do that. And then that the all women base is one thing. To include another podcast, to assume that the network needs another podcast is also bold. It's like, does the data say that? And then you see the thing is go. It was going again. I was watching all this. It was struggling. The first episode did well, but it's a podcast that struggles to get 40, 50,000 views. With all due respect, to everyone there, because the co-host of See the Thing Is, she has her own podcast that does well. Like, her shit's just not working on the Joe Budden network. Like, her normal podcast stuff works. So then to look at the data and then to be like, yo, See the Thing Is not working. You've put money into this, you've put time, you've put effort that you're not going to get back. They're not increasing the Patreon numbers substantially. They're not drawing even anywhere near the numbers that the Joe Budden podcast draws on their YouTube page. So then the next business decision to be, after you see the thing is struggling, the next thing you say is, let's go get another podcast and another women-based podcast with more just popular social media people. Now I can see if, like, these are, like, let's say Earn Your Leisure. They're talking about entrepreneurship. They're talking about food, travel. Even if it was something with a topic, even if it was a podcast with a topic, you now have 3 podcasts that are all in the exact same shadow. It's just people who are popular on social media talking about social media topics. Random social media topics. It's like no one is an expert at anything. It's like no one's gonna, it's like, it would be more interesting if someone was like an expert on sports or an expert on fucking fabrics, so where when there's a dead day or a lull, in content, at least this person can always just resort back and give you just fire content on sports. They got something that their expertise is on. You know, you really listen to an expert professional. So I'm not saying that these people are not professionals. You know, Karen Civil does business. All these people do business. But it's like three podcasts with random people, right? No theme. And then 2 of the 3 podcasts don't even match what the audience looks for. It's like no one's watching these. You have 900,000 subscribers on YouTube, and only 20 to 40,000 are converting over to watch these shows. Even less for the Karen Civil show. So it's just very strange business decisions. And I started my eyebrow raised after I saw See the Thing Is tanking. I saw that show tanking after, you know, it was some episodes in. It was struggling. They even brought Rory on for an episode, which was their most viewed episode to this day. So that shows Joe Budden, like, your people from your podcast will transition over and watch that show if it's interesting to them. Because the episode where Rory got like 200,000 views. Nothing they've done has touched that number. Like, those are Joe Budden podcast numbers, 200,000. So your fans are telling you, like, yeah, we'll transition over and watch this show, like, when it's interesting to us. So it's just strange business decisions to do that. Now, for me, I don't even have Joe Budden's YouTube data. I don't have any of that. But when you look at something simple like his social media, and you look at his Twitter replies, and you look at who's engaging, and you look at his YouTube comments, and you see who's engaging, mostly a male audience. Doesn't mean they don't want women shows. Make it shows that are appealing to them, though, based on what the data says. Because I'm sure even a lot of the women that listen to the Joe Budden podcast don't listen to these women-based podcasts. It's just not in their fashion, right? So you look at Joe Budden's YouTube comments, you look at his Twitter replies. If you just click, I mean, this is what you should do if you're independent. If you are the boss, because you're actually never really the boss. Because if you own all your own stuff, if you're 100% owner, guess who you're beholden to still? The customer. The customer doesn't like something about what you're doing and they stop shopping, you got to change that or you go out of business. You're never truly the boss. You're always beholden to somebody. And if you're at the top of the food chain, you're still beholden to your customers. So it's very important to, number one, respect your customers. Probably won't be a good idea to call them stupid or just take low ball shots at them, especially when you're depending on their Patreon. You're asking for them to subscribe on even less quality content. But anyways, when you look at Joe Budden's, fans, I would say 5 out of 10, when you do that, scroll on social media and you just click on their profile to see who this person is, care about them. 5 times out of 10, they have something about sports. They have a sports cover photo, they have a reference to sports in their name, or they got their favorite team hashtagged. Or even if you just do a quick scroll, skim their timeline, they've talked about sports. So someone with even more data, which would show this, would say, Joe, we should probably add a sports podcast. That probably should have been the first thing. Let me go into my next segment. What should have been done, or what could have been done? It should have been a sports podcast, because they already kind of go into sports on their flagship podcast, the Joe Budden podcast. And they get good engagement. There's small bits where they talk about sports, even if it's just small, saying something people agree with. People talk about that. That kind of semi-trends, depending on your timeline for a day. So I don't know why the first move was to go get a bunch of women on the podcast. Maybe they just wanted women energy around them. You want I don't know, you want to tell somebody what to do. One of the first things should have been a sports podcast. Really, the first thing should have been Rory should have got his own show. Because Rory draws in a lot of audience. We just talked about how you just brought 200,000 viewers to a struggling See the Thing Is podcast. He wasn't on that podcast the week following, and they went right back to the views they were used to getting. So Rory should have had his own show. Rory's probably had opportunities to leave the podcast. I remember at one point talking about a show called Rory and Nori with Drink Champs host Nori. He should have had his own show. It should be Rory and Parks or Rory and somebody talking about music. I don't know why you go out. I don't know why the business decision was to go out and get, well, how many girls was it at first on See the Thing is 2 to 4 girls? Unless you just, I don't know what data set to do that, right? So I can see how it will be frustrating for a Rory Amal, especially if your part of your income is dependent on Patreon subscribers. Like, bro, this shit's not getting us no subscribers.